Well, shall we get started?
Yeah, let's get started. All right, so let's kind of go over some of the things that we've done so far in this series. So we talked about these coastal redwoods and how tall they can be, so up to 380 feet tall. But we also learned about those areas where redwood trees or coastal redwood trees live, and that was because of that fog. Remember, if you can think back to session 2, we saw where that fog lies in those coastal zones. And another cool, unique secret unlocked are those leaves of a redwood tree were able to absorb or are able to absorb that fog.
Yeah, and so between the fog and the special parts of the tree, the adaptations that it has, that's one of the ways it can get so incredibly big.
Yeah, and Lindsay, a lot of different sketches and observations have been coming in our Padlet, and here are just some of those examples. Everyone, thank you for doing so, and you can continue doing so even after this series ends.
Yeah, we've really been appreciating seeing how different scientists at home are thinking about things to see what they found interesting. It's been really incredible. And I've also really enjoyed getting all the questions that have come through too.
Yeah. And so we do have some questions that came through. And so, why do they live so long? And how long do they live? How old is the oldest tree, a redwood tree, ever that is still alive today?
Right? So we're going to be exploring these questions and we're going to try and answer other questions as we go along today because there were so many more. So we'll squeeze in as many as we can.
All right. So, you have been responding and adding your ideas to the Mentimeter. So, our warm-up question was, how do redwoods live for so long?
So if you haven't had a chance, you can go ahead and enter it there and then I'll share that. Cindy, can you enable the screen sharing, please?
Yes.
All right, so let's take a look. So once again, when we look at this word cloud is what we call it, is what we're seeing all of the words that people have submitted. And so when it's bigger word, that means more people have put it into our survey. And when it's smaller, it just means less people have, but they're all really good ideas. So some of the things that I'm noticing is I'm seeing some very similar answers as to how do they get so big and how do they live so long. It's similar that they still need that water, sunlight, roots, and rain can help.
Hmm. Right, I'm also noticing that too. And some of those tree parts, right? Yeah, so it's really interesting. And thank you for sharing your ideas and thinking about the soil, the air around them. So thinking about the environment around and where these trees are located as well.
Right. So, Cindy, I know we're going to be diving into this question of how redwoods live for so long. And one of the things that I'm excited to do is I'm excited just to go back to our sketch for a moment because last time you had us really think about roots and leaves, and there's parts of our sketch that we just really haven't had an opportunity to look at. So, let's go ahead and just look at that sketch for a moment and to really think to ourselves about, what is it that we can add. So we have our tree right here. Let me scoot it up just a little bit. And we're kind of thinking about how redwoods live for so long. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to be looking very closely at the trunk of the tree. Last time we looked at the roots and we looked at the leaves and things like that. But by looking closely at the trunk of the tree and the bark that's on there, the bark is a structure. It's kind of like a skin. What we can do is we can maybe learn a little bit more to answer and unlock this question of how do they live for so long? So students at home, if you have your sketches out, go ahead and just mark down where you find bark on a tree. And we're going to be looking at that closely, so we'll add more details as we go along.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And think about like when you look at that bark, how do you think it might help it live for so long as well? So, what are some of the ideas that you're thinking about right now?
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
So like Lindsay said, we're going to add on. So we'll continue adding on to these sketches and we'll have times where we stop. But if you'd like to keep adding on as we're going along the session, feel free to do so. So why don't we take a close look and actually, so there's a redwood bark, and I know that you have a specimen of redwood bark before we get into some of these other bark pieces that we have here, Lindsay. So you have a specimen right with you, and I think it'd be really fun to look at that.
Okay, so here's in Golden Gate Park, as we mentioned, there's redwood trees. So there was a redwood tree that fell about this time last year, and this is just part of it, and this is the bark. And the bark is the outside of the tree. On the inside of the tree is where the wood is. So if we kind of just look at it from this perspective, we can see that there's layers. So there's a layer here of the bark and the layer here, which is the wood on the inside of the tree.
So that bark is the outer, like the covering of the trunk, and the inside, like you pointed out, is the wood. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
like our skin.
Yeah. So we took a moment to look at that bark, and let's see how it compares when we look at it close to another type of bark. All right, so we have pine bark right next to our redwood bark. And scientists at home, take a moment. What do you notice? How are they the same or how are they different? All right, well, Lindsay, what are some of the things that you notice when you look at them side by side?
Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously there's a little bit of a color difference. The redwood bark
Right.
is a little bit more red. The pine bark is maybe a little bit more gray brown. And I know these are both from very healthy trees, but they just kind of have different textures almost. Like
Mhm.
the pine bark, there's a lot of cracks and it kind of reminds me of scales a little bit.
Yeah, I could see that too. Yeah, and so the different colors and the textures, and then the redwood bark, it looks a little hairy.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that even when you were holding up your specimen. Well, why don't we take a close look? We're going to zoom in into the pine bark.
Yeah, no, Cindy, I noticed this zoomed in picture. We're zooming in on a tree that doesn't look that healthy.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't look that healthy. So, Lindsay, do you notice that it's a little bare, doesn't have any leaves?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so it's unhealthy. And then another evidence of maybe of it being unhealthy is when you look at the bark, what is something that you see on the bark?
Hmm. It looks like there's little holes.
Yeah, I also see that. So scientists at home look at those tiny little holes, but there are a lot of holes. And it looks like it kind of got through into that wood that you were describing from a tree. So now I'm thinking, okay, so what could have possibly done this? So what made these holes?
So that's a good question, Cindy. And here in the lab, we have microscopes. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in a little bit. And when we zoom in, we see this picture on the right. So it's a little bit of a guessing game, but what is it? What does it look like? What does it remind you of?
What is it? What does it remind me of? I don't know. It kind of looks like a, I don't know what would make these holes, but I don't think it would be a rock. It kind of looks like a shiny rock to me.
It looks like a shiny rock. Yeah, so let's we'll zoom out a little bit and we'll get a little bit better focus. Here. So these are bark beetles, and in California, we've had bark beetles moving around the state, and they have been chewing through bark to get to the sweet wood inside pine trees, and that's what they love to eat. And when they eat it, it unfortunately makes it so the pine tree is not very healthy and they die. So one of the biggest threats to trees are bugs that like to eat wood.
Okay, so they're eating the wood. They're getting into that tree that wood part of the tree. So yeah, you can see at the bottom those holes, or how deep that hole is, because it's getting through it. And so um, you're saying that they're not really necessarily eating the bark. They're just trying to get into that wood piece.
Right. Now, if it's okay, I'd like to show you our bark again,
Yeah.
just so we can kind of look at it. So this is a tree that fell down, but I'm curious, do you see any signs of beetles, of holes,
Okay,
of
so
it being unhealthy?
all right. Scientists at home, do you see any holes or evidence of beetles on this bark? Okay, Lindsay, when I look at your bark and you're pretty close up, like we could see how that bark, there are tiny, tiny little holes, and probably like a few of them, but they're really hard to see.
Yeah, and you know, when I look at them closely, those holes, they're not deep. It's like something maybe was like, ooh, wood, but then went to like chew through it and couldn't get through it or didn't like the taste of it or something.
Yeah, so now I'm wondering, like, okay, so why did we not see any evidence? But yeah, maybe some of those ideas that you have, like it tried, it wasn't successful, or maybe it didn't like the taste of it. So when we look at the redwood tree, we're slowly unlocking some of those secrets of how bark can protect a redwood tree. And so a redwood tree is red, right? And then so if it didn't like it, so let's think about, for example, I think you were mentioning, Lindsay, you've told me this before, like an orange. We could think of it like an orange.
Right. Yeah. So like I have my orange here, right? And so on the outside is the peel. And usually what I do is I peel it off because I want to eat the sweet, juicy stuff on the inside, but I don't really like the taste of the peel.
Yeah, I don't like the taste of the peel either, but that inside is pretty yummy. Okay, so the peel is probably like what bugs are tasting. So that bitter taste. They don't want that
Right.
bark. So maybe when those little holes were made by something, and then it
Right.
kind of tasted like that peel.
Yeah. So it doesn't taste good. And so it turns out that for bugs, when they kind of think about when bugs are thinking about wood, this wood tastes really bitter. And it's because of this chemical in it that's called tannin. And tannin doesn't make them feel good. And so it's one of the reasons why redwoods are able to live for so long is because bugs don't like to eat them.
Yeah, and those tannins, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the questions that we got is, why do redwood trees have red wood? And it's also the tannins. So the tannins are actually making that red coloring.
Right. And if we look at, this is another piece of the same tree that fell down. You know, here's the reddish bark on the outside. And then in here, even the wood itself has a little bit of red on it. So even after a tree dies, bugs don't tend to necessarily eat it a whole lot because it still has that tannin in it.
So we just learned that bark acts like a shield of armor. So it has that shield that bark protects it from bugs. Now, I wonder if we could look a little bit closer at that bark tree. So we just learned that we can't see evidence of bugs because of those tannins, and those tannins make redwood trees red. Um, well, why don't we play a little game and think about, when we look closely at a redwood tree, what are we noticing here? What is this?
I love this game. So this doesn't look red, but it is part of a redwood tree.
Yeah, it
And
doesn't look red at all.
yeah, to unlock this secret, we might have to think back a little bit to the first session we did together where we were noticing common patterns in redwood trees and in redwood forests.
All right, well, why don't we take a look to see what we're looking at?
So a lot of our scientists noticed that the trunks of some of the trees looked black, and we can see that here. So there's these black marks. Sometimes the tree would get a little bit hollow and be black, and you can stand inside of them. And it turns out that these are fire scars. So have you ever had a scar? Right? So like I have one on my head from when I was little and I cut myself and it kind of grew over. These are fire scars. And it's called a scar because it makes that mark on the tree. It's like a little bit of an injury that eventually kind of heals over a little bit with time. But it doesn't necessarily kill these large trees.
Right. I could tell that this redwood tree is still very healthy, right? Like this fire scar is big, but the tree continued to grow. There are lots of green leaves. And so it's a really tall tree, even though that scar is there.
Right. And so it's interesting because there's kind of two secrets to unlock about trees, these redwood trees, the bark, and how they survive fire. One of them is that if we're talking about the really big grandfather trees, like much bigger than the tree that I was holding up, but those really big grandfather, grandmother trees, the bark can be up to a foot thick.
Wow, that's really thick. And so it's actually, so they get thicker. The one that you had, so that's a baby tree. So the
Right,
bark was thinner.
right. But the big trees, they get this really big thick bark. And we know that bugs have a hard time chewing through it. They don't like it. The bark itself is pretty hard. But also, there's something special about the bark. Not only does it have the tannins that make it taste bad, like for bugs, but for fires, that bark is full of water.
Oh, so like a sponge.
Yeah, it's like a sponge. And so all that fog drip that we talked about last time, it makes the tree really, really damp and wet. And so because it has this big wet layer surrounding it, that when a forest fire might burn through or come through an area, it's really hard for the forest fire to get through the bark. And if it does, it might only get through one part. And as long as there's some parts of the tree that are intact with bark, it can keep growing. So that's how it is able to keep growing even after there are fires.
So we have, okay, so we have redwood bark that acts like a shield of armor. And now we're learning that they also act like sponges. So it protects them from bugs, it protects them from fires. So we can add on to some of our sketches. So what is something that you are thinking about now? Remember, our question today is how do redwoods live for so long? So you can add some new ideas to your sketches. So go ahead and do that. And then Lindsay is also going to be adding to her sketch. So think back, how did the bark help? Like, how could it help them live a long time? All right. And you can continue adding some of your ideas as we go along. So, one of the things that also our scientist friends have been asking us, well, how long does it take for a redwood tree to grow? Like, how does it like to grow really tall? So we're going to play a little guessing game as we move along. We have some redwood trees in a forest, and we're going to try to guess how many months or years it took to grow to that height. So if we
Ooh, a
look at
guessing game.
a guessing game, so why don't we look at that first part of our forest here, the left part? So how many months or years did it take to grow?
Hmm, I feel like sometimes I see that happen pretty quickly in the spring. So I'm going to say 6 months.
Okay, let's take a look. 1 year. Okay, so it
Okay.
took 1 year to grow that height. Okay, so they got a little bit taller in the next part. So how many years do you think it took?
That next section, I'm guessing it would take maybe 2 years.
15
What?
years. So it takes a while, right? So let's see what we're thinking about when we get to the next part, scientists. So you can also be thinking about then making your guesses at home as well. All right, Lindsay, what are you thinking?
I think that next step, it looks like the trees are maybe twice as big. So maybe let's say 30 years.
Okay, so twice as big, and then all right, you added 15 more years, 30 years. Good guess. All right, so let's move on to the next part.
40 years.
60 years. So
What?
60 years, and this is a young forest as we move along. And then we go to the next one, which is a mature forest. And so part of this word is getting cut off, but mature forest, 100 years old.
That's amazing. So 100 years, that's kind of like some of the trees that surround the California Academy of Sciences.
Oh, so those like baby
Yeah.
redwoods?
Yeah, or maybe they're teenagers, but still, they're not
They're not,
giant,
yeah.
right?
Okay, so let's see how long. So then I wonder at what, like how many years it takes to grow those grandmother trees.
Wow, 200 years. That's amazing. I mean, that's longer than any of us will ever live. Like if we're lucky,
Right.
we might live 100 years.
Right, I
But
was gonna say if we're lucky, yeah, 100 years, and then 200. And we're moving on to that old growth. So those grandmother and grandfather trees just get bigger and are living longer. And then we had this question: well, how old is the oldest redwood? So we can think about that. I know that some of you were thinking about this question too. So it turns out it's 2,520 years old.
wow,
It's a really old tree.
that's interesting. So even though at 200 years old, it might be considered old growth, a really, really old growth forest looks really different than just that 200-year-old
Hmm.
forest.
Yeah,
And I imagine there's different animals that are able to live there because of that.
right. It just creates this whole larger ecosystem up there.
Huh. And I imagine that's why it's probably so important to keep these redwoods growing, as if it takes many lifetimes, human lifetimes, for them to grow this big. We can't just replace them.
Right. Now, Lindsay, there was also this question about, well, how can you tell the age of a redwood tree, right? We know the oldest is that age, but like how can we tell? Like what are some of the things that scientists do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I was fortunate to be able to talk with some of the people who work here and to learn a little bit more about that. So, if a tree, for example, falls over and we can cut it open, what we can do is we can see that there are rings. So let me show you. Okay, so we can see that if we look at this up close, there's these little rings that kind of go, and each ring represents how much a tree grew in a given year. So if you ever get to come to the Academy of Sciences, which I hope you all do, you can come up and you can personally count every single ring on this giant redwood round on the left to see how old it is. So that's one way. But then I was curious, what about trees that are living? Like, how do they know how old those trees are? And so there are scientists who have a special drill that they drill into a tree, and they can take out, it's about the size of a pencil, which is what we see in these pictures here on the bottom, but they're called core samples. And so they can count each of the lines that represent a year and figure out how old a living tree is. And then what they do is they put glue in the living tree afterwards where the core sample came out, just to protect it so the bugs and fire can't get inside, and the tree can keep going.
Wow, so that's really cool. Like yeah, that's a question that our scientist friends were thinking about. Like, okay, so if they're still living, like is it possible to figure that out? Because we could count those tree rings if we have a section like that redwood round.
Right.
But that's really cool that scientists can just use a little tool and be able to bring out these core samples. And I love that challenge, Lindsay, that you just put out there. If you come to the museum, see if you can figure it out.
Yeah. I also know that sometimes it's hard to get here, so I thought we'd kind of look at that
Yeah.
together.
So this redwood tree round, I do know that it stopped growing in 2017, I believe, right?
Right, 2017, it fell over in a big storm. And so that's that outermost ring. And then from there, scientists count their way inwards. So take a moment, scientists at home, think to yourself, what's the next line in represent? What's that next yellow line? How many years do you think? All right, and Cindy, can you share with us?
Yeah. Ooh, 1776.
Yeah, so just that little bit of time. So that's the year the United States became a country, back in the year 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. So this tree is much older than the United States.
Wow. Okay, so then I mean, this tree, we can keep going and we could find out more. We can count these tree rings.
Right. So we can think about civilizations that lived before us. So in the year 1450, when Machu Picchu down in South America was built, that is when this tree was alive. We can go back even further to China in the year 1368 when the Ming Dynasty begins. This tree has lived through a lot of history.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there. I think we have one other year that we can add here.
Right. So the year 1325, when the capital of the Aztec Empire is founded. So this tree is old. By our count, it's 692 years old.
Wow. Well, that's really cool that we were able to count those and think about even like what was happening during these years. 692 years old.
Right.
It's old, but definitely not the oldest.
Right. Right. Because you were saying 2,520 years old for the oldest.
Right. All right. So why do redwoods fall over? So we do know that bark really helps protect them, but what are some other things that are happening in the area where redwoods live?
Right. So some students have been asking these questions of, do natural disasters affect them? Can the power of water from all the rain in redwoods make them fall over? And so all these really good questions. So in California, the natural disasters that are common are fire, which we've already talked about. Earthquakes is another common natural disaster. And earthquakes, we talked about that a little bit in the first session, but redwoods have those roots that reach out and grab onto one another. And so it can help them stabilize if there's a big earthquake. The other type of natural disaster that we get sometimes is flooding. And we know that there's a lot of rain where redwoods are from. So a lot of the redwoods that have fallen because of rain. And often when they're falling, it's because they're on a hillside or they're on the edge of a redwood forest, since they don't have as many roots that can grab on to other redwood friends. So let's just take a look. I wanted you to kind of get a feeling for, this is not even like a giant redwood, but for what it's like when a redwood falls.
Yeah, let's take a look. Wow, and look at all those people that actually witnessed it too.
Right. Yeah. So all of these people were there and they were trying to help clear the road because there had been some mudslides and things like that. And they have to be really careful. So engineering is really important in redwood areas. So engineers can look at and think about, does the hillside look stable? Is the house going to be stable? What's going to be happening? And so that's something else. But in general, redwood trees, they can get really old and really big. And so there are threats to them, but they have these really great parts, these adaptations that really help them live, like what we talked about, the roots, the leaves, the bark, the really strong trunk, all of these different things that can help them get old.
So that redwood round that we have, we learned that it's 692 years old. So we have a photo of it again, where it's located in our museum on the left, and then you could see that same the tree, the fallen tree here on the right. That's in the wild. So it's 692 years old. So Does that mean that this tree experienced in 2017 a big storm, right? So, I think I've heard that it was like on a meadow, so it wasn't holding on to those other redwood roots of other trees.
Right. So we can look at a picture of where it fell, and we actually have a time lapse video of how we got that section of the redwood round to the academy, because it was out on this trail and it was far away. So we had to figure out how to get this big, giant, heavy piece of tree. And that helicopter is going to come over and help us out.
That's cool. So, yes, time-lapse videos go really fast, but we were able to see that that helicopter lifted it up. So we can look at this again. And it has all these people also are helping right at the bottom. So it's
Right.
not just the people at the top that are helping, but it just takes a team to be able to grab this. And all the people in our museum who were able to get that into our museum as well.
Yeah, so museums are helpful because they're full of scientists, like our science museum, that are able to study trees and other organisms and help figure out how to help keep them healthy, how to be curious about nature, and then also to share those things with other people who come and visit us either virtually like you are, or actually come to the building and explore the things that are here.
And these trees, so that tree on the left, that's the tree that we were looking at, that fallen tree, which we got our redwood round from. And if you all notice, scientists, you can see that there is life on that tree. There's lots of plants all over it. So it's creating new life. It's creating an ecosystem for those plants to live. And then one of those interesting photos, Lindsay, I'd love for you to talk to us about. So we're looking at another fallen tree, but those roots, it looks like it's also helping support trees.
Right. So when a lot of these trees fall, we call them nurse logs because they help give baby trees and other plants life. So they are able to take the nutrients and nurse it kind of like a mother might nurse her baby. And those trees can grow up. And way back in the first session when we were talking about redwoods and how big they are, we made this observation about the redwood cones being really tiny, right? So they're these little tiny, tiny redwood cones. And it turns out that redwoods, they don't actually use their cones a whole lot to produce babies. What they do is they use nurse logs and they use the root systems. And those root systems are clones. And so when a tree dies, the roots can grow up towards the top of the sky and get the rain and the sun and the light from where the tree fell. And these new trees can grow. And so they're a lot of times clones of other older trees. And if you want to get really geeky, which I often like to do, one of my favorite facts about redwoods is that because of this, you could be having a redwood tree that's a clone of a tree that was alive thousands of years ago. Because if an 800-year-old tree falls over and then new trees grow into another 800-year-old tree and then fall over and keep growing, it can go on and on and on. And there's really no way for us to exactly know right now how old those root systems are.
Wow. So nurse logs, and we learned so much so far about redwoods, and there's so much more that we can learn. Just like, well, I wonder how old those trees or that redwood tree is. So, or those roots. So, scientists, we got to learn today about redwood bark and those threats that trees experience and how strong that redwood bark is. But sometimes those storms do bring down trees. But look at all the life that it can create after it's fallen.
So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk about these ancient giant trees with you, to explore how scientists learn about them, and hopefully just to give you a little sense of peace and beauty as you explore the world around you. Please give us some feedback. We're putting the link in the chat box and comments field again. And please keep in touch so you can keep adding to the Padlet. You can send us questions and we'll try and answer them either on the website or via email. But we just really want to appreciate the time that you took to be with us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it really has. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this series. And we love trees. We especially love redwood trees. So we hope that after this series, you love redwood trees also. So thank you. And again, let us know what you think. All right. And we'll see those sketches up on that Padlet. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, and say thanks to the trees when you're out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Eileen, for being our chat. Bye, everyone.